President Biden is following in the footsteps of his predecessors tonight by reflecting on his accomplishments and pitching his expansive agenda to a joint session of Congress. Almost 100 days into his presidency, polling shows that so far, the American public is mostly behind the president's big plans. In fact, CBS News polls show he's maintaining strong approval ratings overall at 58% approval. President Biden has higher support at this point in his term than 3 out of the last 4 U.S. presidents. That's except for former President Barack Obama. For more on the significance of tonight's address, let's bring in historian and author Rick Perlstein. His latest book is called Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. Rick, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. We know that President Franklin Roosevelt was the first to set the first 100 days as a marker. What was behind it then, and how has that tradition evolved?
Sure. Of course, President Roosevelt inherited the presidency in March of 1933 when America was coming off several years of the worst depression in history. And like Roosevelt, Biden is inheriting an economy that's in ruins because of a pandemic, largely. And Roosevelt came out of the gate realizing that he had a very narrow window to take bold action to kind of use the public purse in order to restore people's confidence in the economy. And he basically established the lineaments of the modern American state. And after several decades in which Democratic presidents have questioned that legacy, that idea of using the public purse to kind of make the ordinary American's life kind of freer and fairer and more prosperous, Joe Biden is returning to that legacy in another period of economic national emergency.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. During his inaugural address, President Ronald Reagan, as you know, famously said that government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. President Biden has said he wants to change the paradigm. I wonder, given the environment that we have seen as it exists today, how difficult might that actually be?
Well, I think the success he's been showing in the polls really does suggest that the American people are ready to make that transition with him. I think the fact that, millions of American grandparents couldn't hug their children or grandchildren, and now are going to get that opportunity because of a vaccination program that really had so much to do with coordinated federal action. I think that's just one example of people kind of recollecting what the American government can do under sort of progressive governance. And ironically, Joe Biden, when he became a senator in the 1970s, was one of the leaders of the movement in the Democratic Party against that kind of political action. He ran for re-election in 1978 as the most frugal senator. But he's been around long enough that he kind of remembers the old story, which is that if you, the government, as the sovereign expression of the people's will, can help support the kind of programs that states can't do, that municipalities can't do, that individuals can't do. And it can really create a rising tide that lifts all boats. And we're already beginning to see that in things like the jobs numbers and the GDP numbers.
Rick, I'm curious about something that maybe is difficult to quantify, but the impact of tone and tenor. As you well know, Reagan was famously sunny, optimistic in projecting that to the American people. The divisions as they exist today are really so wide in this country. There are Americans who fervently do not believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. Given that environment, you talk about people wanting to be with Joe Biden, according to these poll numbers, in making this transition back to sort of a big government approach. How does that factor in, tone and tenor, into that turn back, given what we know has taken place, including the January 6th insurrection?
Right. Ronald Reagan, of course, projected this sunny optimism. Donald Trump introduced both into the American presidency and conservatism itself, this kind of sour apocalyptic note, the American carnage. And, Joe Biden, even though he's reversing Ronald Reagan's policy legacy, really speaks in that Reaganite argot of, America as the exceptional nation that can do anything if it puts its mind to it, says things with a smile, with this sort of geniality. He seems non-threatening to a lot of people because of his long history in government. Everything he says sounds reasonable, even if it's far to the left of, what a previous president might have said. And ultimately, you don't need, all the American people. You don't need quote unquote unity in order to, press an aggressive agenda. Where the Republicans, for most of the 1960s and 70s were far outnumbered in Congress, right? And they were the loyal opposition. And people in the Republican Party and the conservative movement were just as disgusted with, what liberal Democratic presidents had been doing since the 1930s. The important thing is that presidents then just kind of kept their head down, realized that they had been elected with a mandate and did what they believed themselves to have been elected to do, and didn't worry too much about what was, after all, a minority coalition thought, in the strong belief that what they were doing would help all Americans. And that's very much the sort of political style that Joe Biden has returned to. He doesn't negotiate with himself. And I think in his heart of hearts, he understands that in a party where over half of the elected representatives vote to overturn the results of a free and fair election, that are fundamentally, insurrectionists, that they're not necessarily going to negotiate with him in good faith. And if they want to offer ideas that'll help the American people, great, he'll accept them. But he's not going to, stand there with his hand out and wait for them.
As a historian, Rick, from your perspective, what is it that you're going to be watching for and listening for in the president's address tonight?
I'm going to listen for how he speaks to this very broad agenda to kind of broaden the economic base of security for all Americans with things like paid family leave, with things like free community college, with raising wages for caregivers, as something that helps all Americans, Republicans and Democrats, and how he's going to be speaking to Republicans as voters and Republican elected officials as people who, in a certain sense, are betraying the voters who are broadly in support of these sorts of agendas that he is pursuing.
Right. The White House argument in the Biden administration is that they are pursuing a bipartisan agenda because the poll numbers reflect support from across the political spectrum, even if that's not what Republicans in Washington would seem to suggest. Rick Perlstein, Rick, thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.